In the 24 hours before the Titanic struck an iceberg, the ship's radio room received at least 6 separate warnings about ice directly in its path. 6! Not one vague rumor, 6 specific, detailed messages from other ships naming exact coordinates. And somehow, the largest, most advanced ocean liner in the world sailed directly into the danger those messages described. This isn't a story about a ship that had no warning, it's the opposite. It's a story about a disaster that was, in a very real sense, telegraphed in advance, piece by piece, message by message, and still wasn't stopped. So the real question isn't whether the Titanic's engineers and officers missed the warning signs. It's how so many capable, experienced people could have every piece of the puzzle in front of them and still fail to see the picture it formed. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the ship itself and the culture that built it. The Titanic wasn't just a boat, it was a statement. The White Star Line had built it to be the most luxurious, most technologically advanced ocean liner ever constructed, and the press had already crowned it with a reputation for being practically unsinkable, thanks to its 16 watertight compartments. That reputation mattered, because confidence, once it hardens into certainty, has a way of making people stop asking hard questions. On the morning of April 14, 1912, the first ice warning came in from a ship called the Corona, reporting icebergs directly in the Titanic's path. It reached the bridge, and Captain Edward Smith had it posted for his officers to see. So far, so good. This is exactly how the system was supposed to work. But then, through the rest of the day, more warnings kept arriving. One came from the Baltic in the early afternoon, and this is where the story takes its first uncomfortable turn. Captain Smith showed that warning to Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, who happened to be a passenger on board. Ismay reportedly put the message in his pocket and later showed it to other passengers almost like a curiosity, before the captain eventually asked for it back so it could be posted for the crew. Think about what that moment reveals. A specific, credible warning about the exact danger the ship would encounter that night wasn't treated as an emergency. It was treated, for a little while at least, as a talking point. More warnings followed that afternoon and evening, several more ships reporting bergs and field ice scattered directly along the Titanic's route. And here's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't one missed message slipping through the cracks. It was warning after warning after warning arriving throughout an entire day, describing the same danger from different directions, and each one somehow failing to trigger the kind of urgent response you'd expect. So why didn't it? Part of the answer lies in the technology itself, and this is the twist a lot of people don't expect. The Titanic's wireless radio wasn't primarily there for safety. It was, first and foremost, a luxury feature, a way for wealthy passengers to send personal telegrams back to shore, bragging about the voyage, arranging business, staying in touch with the world they'd left behind. The 2 wireless operators on board worked for the Marconi Company, not the ship's officers directly, and their job was overwhelmingly about processing that flood of paying passenger traffic. That mattered enormously on the night of April 14th. At around 9:40 p.m., a ship called the Mesaba sent one of the most precise ice warnings of the entire voyage, describing a massive ice field lying almost exactly in the Titanic's path. But that message reportedly never made it to the bridge. The wireless operator on duty, Jack Phillips, was buried under a backlog of personal passenger messages, and evidence suggests the Mesaba's warning simply sat there, unprioritized, because it hadn't been formatted with the correct prefix that marked it as an urgent message requiring the captain's personal attention. It was a warning that could have changed everything, quietly lost in the noise of holiday telegrams. Then, later that night, came a moment that still stands out as one of the chilling near misses in the entire disaster. The Californian, a ship stopped dead in the water because it had run into the very ice field everyone had been warning about, tried to radio the Titanic directly to say exactly that. "We've stopped. We're surrounded by ice." Phillips, still overwhelmed with passenger traffic, cut off the message and told the Californian's operator to keep quiet because he was busy working the powerful shore station at Cape Race. The Californian's radio operator, reasonably enough, gave up and went to bed for the night. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something important. None of this happened because anyone involved was careless or indifferent to safety. Phillips was simply doing his job as it had been defined for him, prioritizing passenger business the way the system expected. The failure wasn't one person's mistake. It was a structure that hadn't yet learned to treat a new technology as a life-or-death safety tool instead of a convenience. But the warnings weren't the only problem. Even if every message had reached the bridge instantly, there's a separate, quieter failure that made the danger even harder to see coming, and it involves something almost absurdly small. Before the Titanic ever left port, a locker on the bridge containing a pair of binoculars intended for the lookouts in the crow's nest was locked, and the officer who had the key, David Blair, was reassigned off the ship just before departure. In the shuffle of the crew change, that key left with him. It's a small, almost mundane detail, a missing key, but it meant that on the clearest, calmest night of the voyage, the two men stationed in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were scanning the horizon for icebergs with nothing but their eyes. And the ocean that night made their job even harder in a way almost no one anticipated. The sea was unusually calm, glassy, and still, with almost no waves. Normally, waves breaking against the base of an iceberg create a visible white line that lookouts can spot from a distance. That night, there was no white line, no warning ripple, just dark water and a dark shape blending almost seamlessly into the night until it was almost directly ahead. By the time Fleet spotted the iceberg and rang the warning bell, the ship was already too close to fully avoid it. The crew turned hard and reversed the engines, and in doing so, they may have actually made things worse. Many maritime historians now believe that if the Titanic had struck the iceberg head-on, the front compartments would have crumpled and flooded, but the ship likely would have stayed afloat. Instead, the turn caused the iceberg to scrape along the starboard side, opening a series of smaller gashes across multiple compartments at once. The ship's watertight design could handle several compartments flooding. It could not handle that many, that spread out, all at once. There's one more piece to this puzzle that researchers have only fully understood in recent decades, and it goes down to the very metal the ship was built from. Metallurgists who examined recovered pieces of the Titanic's hull found that the steel plates and the rivets holding them together contained higher levels of impurities than modern steel would allow, and in the frigid Atlantic water, that made the metal significantly more brittle than engineers at the time understood cold steel to be. It's a debated point among historians and metallurgists exactly how much this contributed, but the evidence suggests that materials behaving differently than expected in that kind of cold may have made the damage from the collision considerably worse than it otherwise would have been. So when you line up every piece, the warnings buried under passenger telegrams, the missing binoculars key, the eerily calm sea, the fateful decision to turn instead of strike head-on, and steel that failed in ways no one fully understood at the time, you start to see the real answer to the question everyone asks. The Titanic's engineers and officers didn't miss one obvious warning sign. They were working inside a system and an era that hadn't yet learned how to take 100 small warning signs seriously, because catastrophic failure on that scale had simply never happened to a ship like this before. That's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Titanic disaster. It wasn't a single failure. It was dozens of small, individually forgivable decisions made by capable people working within the limits of what their time understood that all lined up on one clear, calm night into something none of them saw coming until it was already too late.